Colette, and I'm here today with Professor Adrian Kerr. And in our history offerings this summer, we've moved on to the legendary Cleopatra. And Professor Kerr is going to share with us the facts versus the fiction.
Hello, Terry.
Hello.
Yes, well, Elizabeth Taylor, of course, brought the whole concept of Cleopatra to the big screen, and most of us of our age will remember that movie and the famous actors in it. And of course, the Hollywood had to make it an interesting movie, an interesting love story, which it was, and 50% of it is factually based. And so many people say, well, which 50%?
Yeah.
And so I'm going to take you through the story of, first of all, who she was. And of course, she wasn't Egyptian, she was Greek. The post-Alexander Empire split up into a number of segments. Ptolemy, Macedonian, was his admiral, and he grabbed Egypt and created for 300 years, the Greeks, Macedonians, ran Egypt. The very last king of Egypt realized that the Romans were the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean, and so bequeathed the looking after of his kingdom when he died to the Roman Senate, hoping that they would control his two children. One was Cleopatra the Seventh, Elizabeth Taylor, and the other was her 10-year-old brother. His name was Ptolemy the 13th. So can you imagine a teenage girl sharing the throne of Egypt with a 10-year-old brother? Not very long. So she was booted out and went to live in Syria, and he aspired to be the king of Egypt on his own. At which point Julius Caesar arrives, and he is a very old man. He's 43. And he's been fighting wars all his life, and he arrives, and he is introduced to Cleopatra, and she wants to try and persuade Julius Caesar to back her case and kick out her brother. Now, of course, you have a young 20s lady and a very ancient Roman general, and the attraction is obvious. Nobody ever wrote that Cleopatra was a beauty. They said she was very clever, she spoke many languages, she was the queen of Egypt, she was very highly educated, and she was entertaining. You can interpret what that means. But the two of them fell in love, her brother was bumped off, and they went on a cruise, and eventually their son, Caesarion, was born, at which point Julius Caesar had to skedaddle back to Rome to sort out the empire. And then, because of his growing strength and stature and potential movement towards being king, he was assassinated by Brutus and Cassius and Casca and so on. And then who popped up to then run the empire was a joint deal with his nephew and Marcus Antonius. Mark Antony very cleverly said, I'll take the eastern part of the empire where the money is, and he summoned Cleopatra. She was extremely wealthy, had a huge fleet, fabulous jewels, and she was called to Tarsus, St. Paul of Tarsus, and there she met Richard Burton. And they fell instantly in love. And there's a story about she took off an enormous pearl to show how wealthy she was, took it off her ring, dropped it into a goblet of wine, and it dissolved. And he was amazed that she had so much money she could actually destroy a beautiful, valuable item. And I'll tell you whether that story is true or not. Anyway, she captivated him, and that was his downfall, because he had aspirations to take over the empire and nominated his sons to be successors to him and Cleopatra, at which point the Senate got very fed up, because they had the prerogative to name kings and queens and governors, and so war took place between Octavian and the Senate versus Cleopatra and Richard Burton. And it all went horribly upside down in a tragic battle called Actium, where Cleopatra and Richard Burton left the field of battle winning, and their people thought they were running away, and the whole crashed, and the Senate won. So he comes back to Alexandria, and she realizes the game is up, and she leaves a post-it note on his quarters saying, I've killed myself, you must do the same, because the Romans are going to get us. Because Octavian had arrived in Alexandria. So he said, I'll kill myself, and got a sword and cut himself open, which, by the way, is my medical tip for the day. If you're thinking of suicide, it's a very painful, slow process. 6, 7, 8 hours, depending how quickly you bleed to death. So he was moaning and groaning, writhing on the floor, and she took pity on him, had him brought into her boudoir, and there he died in her arms. Now, what does Cleopatra do? she hears a knock on the door, and Octavian, this young 22-year-old nephew of Julius Caesar, who's the power to be, knocks on the door and says, "Come back with me to Rome, and I will show you the people of Rome, and they'll love to see you." And she says, "Now, I seduced Julius Caesar, I seduced Mark Antony. What are my chances of actually influencing this young man who is probably gay?" And she decided that very small, and she would just be made an example of and end a horrible death in Rome. So she said to him, "Give me the night to pack up a few things, and we'll leave tomorrow for Rome." Next morning, they came and knocked on her door. The handmaidens opened the door, and she had committed suicide. She was dead in her bed. And the reason why we say it was a snake that killed her, I'm not going to spoil it, but I will explain how we came by that story, and is it true?
Mm-hmm. You know, huh?
I know.
Right.
I was there.
Right. Well, this is going to be really interesting, and along the way you will learn a little bit more about Cleopatra, some interesting details, including her makeup.
And the makeup that you see in the 60s movies was understated.
Wow.
They wore even more makeup in
Interesting.
reality, and I'll explain why that was.
Yeah. All right. Well, we hope to see you there at Cleopatra.